An economist and an ecologist are blown off a tall building. The ecologist is panicking but notices that the economist is very calm as they plummet towards the ground. Why so calm, he asks. The economist replies, because demand will create a parachute. The IMF report, Causes and Consequences of Income Inequality, a global perspective, warns that the gap between rich and poor in advanced economies is now at its highest level in decades, making widening income inequality the defining challenge of our time. It says that advanced economy policymakers need to focus on the poor and the middle class if they want to boost economic growth globally. It says that fiscal redistribution can help raise the income share of the poor and middle class and thus support growth. The University of Cambridge economist Ha-Joon Chang comes to a similar conclusion, saying the 35-year experiment with trickle-down economics has failed for most people and that it is regrettable that there is so much money and power at stake for its true beneficiaries to accept that it has failed. The advocates of trickle-down economics argue that when the rich get extra income, they invest it and create jobs and income for others, so everyone is better off. The trouble is, the theory has not worked. For example, in the UK, upward income redistribution since 1980 has seen the richest 1% of the population increase their share of national income from 5% of national income to over 10%, but the annual growth rate of income per person has fallen. So from 1960 to 1980 it was 2.5%, after the upward income redistribution it fell to 1.8%. Concentration of income at the top has boosted the political influence of the very rich, allowing them to push for policies that benefit them rather than society as a whole. The UK financial sector successfully lobbied for light touch regulation, which was lucrative but contributed to the 2008 global financial crisis. We need to do more to address the stunted circumstances that rob too many boys of the chance to become responsible independent men and too many girls of the chance to become responsible independent women. The situation in Australia deserves more attention from the media and policymakers than it receives. The St Vincent de Paul Society published to Australia's a report on poverty in the land of plenty. It noted that almost 3 million Australians live in relative poverty. They may have very low paying jobs with insecure and inadequate hours or no paid work at all. They often have poor health or are living with a disability. They struggle to pay their bills or to be able to afford groceries and other essentials. Many live in insecure housing or are forced into a state of homelessness in one of the world's most prosperous nations. Now, this from the country which, perhaps more than any other, was a pioneer in social inclusion and ensuring that there was no such thing as working poor. We are the land of the Harvester judgment. The Harvester decision in 1907 by Justice Higgins, then President of the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration, became part of the fabric of Australian life. It determined a wage that would be sufficient for a worker with a wife and 3 children. It recognised the need to fix fair and reasonable wages, the need for workers to live in dignity, the need for a worker to be provided with a wage sufficient to support a family.
A male worker.
Well, indeed, they did it in 1907. But for the past 30 years, those at the top of Australia's income distribution have been taking a greater share of Australia's income. Since the mid-2000s, wages have not kept pace with productivity improvements. Average wages are growing more slowly than productivity. According to the ACTU, the fall in the labour share of income has accelerated since mid-2000. The decency of living standards for lower paid workers, one of Australia's finest achievements, is being eroded away. The Australian Catholic Council for Employment Relations publication Working Australia 2015, Wages, Families and Poverty, sets out in detail the deterioration of lower paid workers' circumstances between 2000 and 2015. If the globalisers, the privatisers, the deregulators, the free marketeers had been right about the wisdom of their 1980s medicine, this should not have been the case. The report concludes that we have not had a fair and balanced distribution of the benefits of economic growth, and that since 2001, there has been a growing inequality in the labour market and society as a whole. Australia's national accounts show the average income Australians receive shrank for each of the 4 quarters to June 15 to be 3.8% below its 2011 peak. Real net national disposable income per capita has contracted. One of the reasons for the fall is that the world is paying us considerably less for our key exports, iron ore and coal, than it used to. This is squeezing incomes for businesses, households and governments alike. The question must be asked, why did we allow our economy to become so reliant on the price the world would pay us for coal and iron ore in the first place? The policies of globalisation, privatisation, deregulation, free trade and the free movement of goods and people were supposed to make us less reliant on such vicissitudes. In reality, we are more vulnerable than we were before. For the past 30 years, Australia has been undergoing an experiment which will have great consequences for future generations. We have not been alone. Quite a few other countries have travelled the same path. Free market liberalism, with those hallmarks of globalisation, privatisation, deregulation, the free movement of goods and the free movement of people. Its advocates said it would strengthen the Australian economy and make us more resilient to external shocks. But far from making our economy more diverse and resilient, we have become narrow and vulnerable. We have much higher levels of unemployment than we did 30 years ago. We have much higher levels of youth unemployment, much worse long-term unemployment, and serious problems of underemployment. We have much larger foreign debt and much larger budget deficits. The distribution of wealth between rich and poor is becoming less equal. And the social problems generated by frustrated ambition, drugs, crime, mental health problems, homelessness, are on the rise too. But the people who dug us into this hole are unrepentant. They want us to keep digging. They talk about the need for economic reform, which is code for more privatisation and more deregulation and freer movement of goods and people. They talk about leadership, which is code for demanding that politicians do what they want rather than what the voters want. This is a battle which is being fought out on many fronts, but one of the most important is on the trade front. The first problem with modern trade deals is that they are done in secret. Some corporations or lobbyists might be in the know, but ordinary Australians are not, and once the deals are signed, we're told it's too late. We can't go back and renegotiate them. The second problem is that while the deals used to be about tariffs and quotas, increasingly they are about government policies right across the board. They are in fact about preventing governments from taking action on a whole range of fronts. The most insidious development in this regard has been the insertion of investor-state dispute settlement clauses. These clauses started out innocently enough, protecting companies from being nationalised without compensation by some tin-pot dictator. But they now put at risk democratic governments which seek to safeguard people's health or seek to safeguard their environment. These clauses give an advantage to foreign companies which Australian companies don't have access to. The cases are heard by tribunals of investment arbitrators who lack the independence of national courts. The arbitrators can be arbitrators one day and advocates the next. The hearings are secret, there is no system of appeals or precedents, and why should we allow ourselves to be sued for looking after our people? There is a strong pushback against the use of trade treaties to promote the free movement of goods across borders, regardless of its impact on local jobs or local standards of environment protection or consumer safety. The strong opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership from both Republican and Democrat US presidential candidates is a classic example of this. I acknowledge that President Barack Obama is investing heavily in the TPP. I can't help but point out that treaties weren't always so fashionable with US presidents. George Washington said in his farewell address in 1796 that, quote, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." And Thomas Jefferson said in his inaugural address of 1801, "Peace, commerce and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." My own view on the TPP controversy is that, Given that it's now been confirmed that the US Congress will not consider the TPP implementing legislation until after the November presidential election, there is no case for us to rush in ahead of them in our consideration of it. I continue to support more independent analysis of the costs and benefits of the TPP for Australia, for example from the Productivity Commission. I think that one of the most critical issues in relation to inequality and fairness is the question of intergenerational equity. Do we want to be remembered as a generation that wrecked the planet and passed on an inheritance and legacy of unemployment, mental health problems, drugs, conflict, terrorism to the next generation? Surely we have an obligation to pass on to our children and to our grandchildren a world in as good a condition as the one our parents and grandparents gave to us. We do not have a right to trash the joint. So how are we going so far? On the weekend in the Sunday Age, Neelima Chauhan did a fine job reporting the book by Jennifer Rayner, Generation Less, How Australia is Cheating the Young, outlining that young Australians have fewer opportunities for full-time work and affordable housing and therefore don't enjoy the security and predictability that my generation did and does. Young people today have been fitted up with an axis of financial evil: job insecurity, housing unaffordability and student debt. Now that message was reinforced by the Grattan Institute Chief Executive John Daly, quoted as saying, "There is a real danger of a generation that will be less well off than its parents." And he is spot on. The opportunities that I and my generation had, free tertiary education, lots of job and career opportunities, affordable housing, seem a distant memory for way too many young people. The number of long-term unemployed has risen dramatically in the last 7 years and is now well over double what it was in 2008. Those who do have jobs have less secure jobs. The Saturday Age report highlighted the case of a worker who only knew if he had work when he received a text message just 15 minutes before his shift was due to start at a clothing warehouse. As a statement of the bleeding obvious, it is impossible to plan his day or his life around that kind of insecure work. It is a throwback to the work arrangements on the waterfront 100 years ago, when dock workers would stand in a line waiting to be picked out for a day's work. The rise of casual, contract and labour hire jobs with far fewer protections for workers is a feature of the last 20 years. More than 2 million workers are now engaged as casuals, and more than 1 million are contractors or in labour hire. Young people are also getting the rough end of the pineapple in relation to housing. Whereas I and my generation had opportunities to buy and live in detached houses, high-rise apartment towers in central Melbourne are now being built at 4 times the maximum densities allowed in such crowded cities as New York, Hong Kong and Tokyo. These hyperdense skyscrapers are being built with little regard to the effect on the residents within or their impact on the streets below or on neighbouring properties. So, if we are failing future generations, and I'm convinced that we are, what can we do about it? I think employment is one key. We need to get fair income about full employment. Now, there are plenty of captains of industry and economists who immediately changed the language and the objective of full employment to that of creating jobs, but they are not the same thing at all, even though they may sound similar. The objective of creating jobs is used as cover for the desire to reduce workers' pay conditions and rights. It is claimed that reducing these things will increase labour market flexibility and thereby create jobs. It's also used as a battering ram against the environment, with the need to create jobs used to justify all manner of environmental atrocities. We should not agree to surrender pay and conditions or our beautiful and unspoiled environment. This would be the opposite of intergenerational equity. So how do we achieve full employment then, given its importance? I think that 5 steps are crucial. In Australia, we should wind back our migrant worker programs, which have skyrocketed in the past decade. In a stable or slowly growing population, workforce ageing will help solve unemployment. As workers retire, unemployed workers or young people entering the labour force get job opportunities. This is how things used to be. But when we are running massive, permanent and temporary migrant worker programs, the unemployed and young people entering the market find themselves up against ferocious competition from new arrivals. The large size of these programs puts us on a treadmill. No matter how fast we create jobs, we still have unemployment above 6%. More than 760,000 Australians are out of work, a totally unacceptable figure, and a recipe for drugs, crime, mental health issues, and even terrorism. As recently as the year 2000, the former Immigration Minister, Philip Ruddock, said that net migration might average out at 80,000 per annum. Funny thing must have happened on the way to the forum, because his government subsequently increased it to over 200,000 per annum, where it still sits. Second, we should focus on education, skills and training. What has happened to technical and further education is a scandal. Back in the late 1980s, the Hawke government set out to open the technical and further education sector to private competition. The idea was that competition would lift standards and be good for students. The result has been the opposite. Private training colleges have been quite unscrupulous. Their interest has not been in the students, it has been in making money. They get students in and they churn them through. They have no interest in whether the students get the skills they need to find work afterwards. As long as the students or taxpayers pay them, they're all right, Jack. Then there are the universities. The Hawke government introduced student fees in the 1980s, and the Gillard government subsequently removed cap funding and enrolment targets in 2010. Now, the Liberal government wants to deregulate student fees. This would be a disaster. When I went to university, there were no fees and places were allocated on the basis of academic merit. If the coalition succeeds in deregulating university fees, the system will have been turned on its head. Academic merit and performance will count for nothing. Your capacity to pay fees, or more commonly your parents' capacity to do so, will count for everything. How are academic standards and quality expected to survive such an onslaught? My generation had free post-secondary and tertiary education, mostly courtesy of Gough Whitlam. Introducing fees was a mistake, and we should now be looking to reduce these fees rather than increase them, as various pundits proposed. Third, we need to back science. The 2014-15 budget cut a staggering $150 million from the science budget, including a $115 million cut to the CSIRO. CSIRO said these funding cuts would cause the loss of nearly 1,400 workers, over 20% of its workforce, including 500 science and research staff. We can't compete with the rest of the world behaving in such a short-sighted way. Fourth, we need to back manufacturing. During the mining boom, we acted as if it didn't matter if all our manufacturing went offshore. But to have all our eggs in the mining and agriculture baskets is foolish and short-sighted. Recent developments around the iron ore price reinforce this. We need a diverse economy, and manufacturing provides good jobs in the middle of society, not rich but not poor. It brings with it research and engineering expertise, the kinds of things that distinguish successful nations from unsuccessful ones. And finally, we should back the home team, Australia. Our personal buying habits, our government buying habits, our foreign takeover laws should support Australian jobs and Australian industry. It is remarkable that when the Victorian Labor government says it's going to use local steel, that we have economic commentators saying you can't do that, it's a breach of our trade agreements. We should have food labelling laws that spell out what food is Australian and what is imported, so consumers can make an informed choice, and we should not enter into trade agreements that contain investor-state dispute settlement clauses or other provisions which act as a barrier to governments carrying out the wishes of the electorate on matters like these. There is much that we can do which will generate full employment, and it needn't involve trashing the environment. But if we don't do it, then future generations will be deprived of the opportunities that so many of us have had. And the big question for us now is, do we want to be remembered as greedy, selfish, ignorant, short-sighted, or remembered as visionary, intelligent, compassionate and generous? Thank you.